So in front of me here, I have the Ruger 96-44 lever action 44 Magnum carbine. And when we initially developed our 10-round magazine for the Ruger 44 rifles, it was designed initially around the 77-44 bolt gun. But after some experimentation, we realized that it would also fit and feed the semi-automatic Deerfield and the 96-44 lever gun. But what we also discovered is that while the 10-round magazine would fit and feed ammo into the chamber of the 96-44, it wouldn't eject the rounds effectively. The spent cartridge would typically get hung up in the ejection port here. So the purpose of this video is to show you the fix that we came up with. And now this magazine is 100% functional in the 96-44. And if you're interested in buying one of our 10-round magazines for the 96-44, we will include at no charge the simple half-round piece of brass rod that I will demonstrate how that installs in the gun, and it doesn't affect the function of the gun whatsoever, and allows our 10-round magazine to fit, feed, and eject spent cartridges flawlessly. So we'll get started, and the first thing you need to do is remove the barrel band on the front of the gun. And then the single screw in the bottom of the gun that holds the stock on. And the whole thing just kind of buttonholes out of there like that. Set the stock off to the side, and now we'll focus on removing the trigger group from the bottom of the receiver, which is actually a very simple procedure. There are two pins that hold this whole trigger lever assembly into the upper receiver, and you just push them out, and they actually come out very easily. That, and now this whole lever trigger assembly just lifts right out of the gun. And we'll set that off to the side for the moment. Now, if we can get the camera to focus down in here, right here, and the inside of the upper receiver here, the receiver, is a groove, part of the casting apparently. We could not determine that there was any real reason that that groove was there. So we just, from a standpoint of experimentation, we decided to fill that groove to see if it would facilitate the ejection of a spent cartridge from our 10-round magazine. And we just came up with this half-round piece of brass rod cut to an appropriate length, and it just drops right in there, just like that. It doesn't interfere with anything. Even if you go back to the factory 4-round magazine, it has no effect on its ability to feed, fire, and function. So you can drop that thing in there, and it's relatively straightforward. And what we recommend as well, if you decide to buy one of the magazines and install this brass insert, that you glue it in some way, shape, or form with an epoxy, a little thin layer of JB Weld to assure that it stays. Now, the test we have run, we just dropped this thing in here and took a punch and a hammer, because while it drops in relatively easily, you can give it a couple of final taps and it stays put. and having fired multiple rounds through the gun with that thing just tapped in place, it never moved. But once again, I might recommend using a 2-component epoxy or a thin layer of JB Weld to make sure that it doesn't come out at all, ever. So one of the things you need to make note of after you put this thing in is that it is flush across the top here. We can't afford to have it sticking up above this ledge inside the receiver, otherwise the bolt will drag on it. So you can see that it jumped around a little bit in there. I'll tap it in place again and reassemble the gun, and you can see that it doesn't interfere with anything. But like I say, in the long run, you would really be better off using a glue and epoxy of some sort to hold it in place. So now that we've got the insert in there, it's time to put the lever trigger assembly back into place. So the best way to do this is to open the lever up and allow this to pivot back over and nest itself in its rested position there. And we're going to hold this just like this and lower it back into the upper receiver. So now, here's one thing that we discovered after trial and error, because it didn't seem to want to go back in readily. And so there's this little cocked indicator right here that tells you that the rifle has a loaded chamber effectively. And that thing has to be sticking up as you put this assembly in there, otherwise you can't get the pins back through. So what it takes is you just make sure you bring it all the way to the back here and push it in place right there. Now you can see that the loaded chamber indicator is sticking up, and it takes just a little jockeying, and then you can fit the pins back through, and they just slide in pretty easily. Yep. Push in like that. Okay, so that's basically the installation procedure. Now, before you put the stock back on and everything, you can check to see if your half-round piece of brass rod is interfering with the mechanism here simply by actuating it. And it's not, so it's in the correct position. And you'll also notice that even when the bolt is open, it still has that brass rod trapped at the back end. So like I say, we shot a number of magazines through this thing without the insert, the brass insert, being glued in place, and it never moved. So at this point, we'll go ahead and put the stock back on it. There we go. Close the lever and just screw the stock back on, put the barrel back on, and you're good to go. All right, that's it. It's that simple. Thank you. So at the very back of the inside of the receiver is a spring-loaded plunger here that drives this loaded chamber indicator right there. So as you're reassembling this thing, and you put the trigger group and lever assembly back in the receiver. If this thing isn't seated all the way to the back properly, and it doesn't push up that brass pin, that means it's not in the right position. So, there's a couple of things that can happen here if it fights you at all. This little device right here is what actually pushes on that brass button that's inside. That little mechanism right there. And as you're playing with this, taking it apart, moving it around, this thing can move out of position. And it comes up and it just slides on a shaft right there. And if it gets out of position like this, you'll never get it back in the gun. So you just need to be certain that when you go to put this back in there, this thing is sitting nested down in there and flush across here and not sticking up. So once again, get that lever opened all the way. This sits, you can see that captive piece right there is what actually pushes up on this brass button in here, the chamber, loaded chamber indicator.
Yeah.
Okay, so when inserting the trigger assembly here, you need to have the bolt itself slightly forward of its rearmost position. Otherwise it interferes. It runs into the brass button that's in there. So you just let that come forward. You close the lever just about that much so that this piece is sitting forward of the very rearmost position. And you insert that in there. And now you can see the loaded chamber indicator is sticking up. And this way your pins will drop in without fighting. And it seems as though if you put the front pin in first, it helps with the alignment of the rear pin. And so before you stick it back in the gun stock, go ahead and just actuate the lever to make sure that it's not dragging on your brass insert. And there you have it.